Okay, students, hello. Today we will see how the enzymes are inhibited. So, first thing we need to know that what are the inhibitors? Inhibitors. So, when we were studying about enzyme activity or enzyme mechanism, we have seen that enzyme can bind with particular substrate and it forms enzyme substrate complex which break down and forms the product. So finally we get the product. So what happens? There may be some compound present which mimic with the substrate, which have the structural resemblance with substrate, known as inhibitors, can be represented by I. So what happens? Uh, Sometimes these inhibitors can bind with the enzymes and form enzyme inhibitor complex. Definitely, when the enzyme is not binding to the substrate, the product will not form and the reaction will inhibit. So this is the enzyme inhibition when the structures or the components resembling in structure with the substrate known as inhibitors bind with the enzyme and enzyme substrate complex is not able to form. Instead of it, enzyme inhibitor complex is formed and the product will be not formed. So this is enzyme inhibition. It may be of two type, mainly of two type: competitive and non-competitive. So it is very clear with these two terms. Competitive means there is a competition in between the inhibitors and the substrate. So what happens exactly? An enzyme is present and you know that there is a active site present in any enzyme, and the substrate can bind on this active site and it will form enzyme substrate complex. Suppose this is the substrate, but there is one more component resembling with the structure of this substrate known as inhibitor. Suppose it is like this. So what happens? Instead of this substrate, this inhibitor will bind over this active site and substrate will not able to bind with this active site because the active site is not available. So what happens? It will bind with the inhibitor and it will form enzyme inhibitor complex. So there is a competition between substrate and inhibitors. So that's why it is known as competitive inhibition. The other kind of inhibition is non-competitive inhibition. So what happens? As the name clarifying, there is no competition in between the substrate and inhibitor. What happens? Suppose this is an enzyme and this is active site and this is our substrate and this is our inhibitor. So what will happen? It will not bind over this active site. It will bind at some other site near to the active site. Suppose this is the site. So it will bind over here. And what happened? This, oh sorry, let me take other color. So suppose this is an enzyme and this is our substrate and this is our inhibitor. So inhibitor will bind at the site other than active site, and it will distort the structure of enzyme, or it will distort the active site. So definitely there is no competition between this substrate and enzyme, because substrate and inhibitor, sorry, and because the inhibitor is binding at the other side. So though the active site is available for binding of substrate, but it won't be able to bind it with it because the site is distorted now. So that is why the enzyme substrate complex will not form, and the product will not be formed. So this is other kind of inhibition known as non-competitive inhibition. You can also uh, find one more type of inhibition known as feedback inhibition. Feedback. What happens in this? Suppose there is a series of reaction there is a substrate known as A is forming B is forming C is forming D. The chain, also a series of reaction is going on. So what happens when the uh, end product produces in a bulk? So whenever there is a bulk quantity of end product, it will inhibit the reaction feedback back. So it will react inhibit the first or the enzymes present in the beginning, so it will stop the first reaction, and thus the end product will automatically stop. So this is known as feedback inhibition. So let's revise one more time with animated video. So in general, what happens there, this is an enzyme, and this is active site. This is active site. You can see the enzyme is binding with the substrate is binding with the active site, and there is some other site present over the enzyme known as allosteric site. You can see in this enzyme structure. So thus the enzyme substrate complex is formed, and then substrate is broken down into the product, and it is enzyme is now ready to bind with the other substrate. What happens when the inhibition is taking place? So there is a competitive blocker, you can see, and the inhibitor is bind with the active site, and the active site is not present, or active site is not free for the binding of substrate. So this was the competitive inhibition. Now we will see the non-competitive inhibition. What happens? The non-competitive inhibitor or blocker will bind the other site known as allosteric site. So it will distort the site, though it is present for the binding of substrate, active site is present, but there is no reaction because it cannot bind now.